I took the job because it was supposed to be simple. One last contract on Brinelock, a planet that was always better at letting go than holding on. The work order was clear. Run a final tether line on the Tidelock platform, map 3 aging gravity anchors, and collect enough hazard pay to buy a transport ticket clean off this collapsing rock. I'd be gone before the seasonal tides turned. That was the plan. A plan that depended on the world staying put for just a little longer. Brinelock is what happens when terraforming goes wrong. Officially, it's a Tier 2 terraform failure. In practice, it's a planet of 84% ocean and a handful of shattered continents held together by a stabilizer grid that's been groaning under the strain for 50 years. The unique problem, and the reason anyone still comes here, is the gravity. It isn't constant. It pools in wells deep in the ocean or gathers in atmospheric folds that can crush a transport skiff into a ball of scrap metal. Out on the fringes, you get sink fields, localized zones where the planet's mass just gives up, pulling matter inward until it's gone. A sink field is just a hole in the world's floor. My wife Leonie walked into one 3 years ago during a survey. Her body was never found. No wreckage, no signal, just a tear in the map where a person used to be. The Tidelock platform was built over one of the oldest recorded anomalies. It squats in the deep ocean like a rusted metal insect. Its legs, massive anti-sink pylons, driven deep into the seabed. My job wasn't fishing, not really. I'm a cartographic analyst. My work is with maps, with the shape of things. The crew here call themselves gravity fishermen, a romantic name for a grim business. They use deep field lines and esoteric lures to plumb the gravitational tides, hoping to pull up extra-dimensional matter or harvest energy spikes. Most of it is superstition wrapped around physics. You cast a line into a gravitational distortion, and sometimes something comes back. You earn pull credits if you can stabilize and contain it. Mostly you just lose expensive equipment. I claimed my bunk, a low-lit metal box that was damp to the touch, and started my diagnostics. I like the routine, the precise calibration of instruments, the clean logic of data streams. It's a comfort. I ran my thumb over the screen of my survey tablet, brushing away dust that wasn't there, a habit I picked up after Leonie. She always said your tools were your lifeline. Under my collar, I could feel the worn fabric of her old field bandana, a faded square of red I'd worn ever since. It didn't make sense, but not much did anymore. That's when I first saw Quill Sterling. He was one of the line operators, a younger man with sun-creased skin and long hair tied in braids threaded with metallic wire. He was standing barefoot on the main deck's grating, in the path of the stinging sea spray, staring out at the winch assembly. He said, "You feel the pull better when you're grounded. I just thought it was a good way to lose a toe." He turned, and his eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, found mine. He offered a slow, calm nod, as if we were meeting in a temple instead of on a decaying industrial rig. The first 2 anchor stabilizations went exactly as planned. I mapped their decay, rerouted the failing power conduits, and signed off on the reports. All that was left was the 3rd anchor, the oldest one. Right at the heart of the anomaly Tidelock was built on. The final tether. I prepped the launch sequencer myself. The crew gave me a wide berth, respecting the rituals of the trade even if I was just a contract surveyor. I ran the pre-flight checks 3 times. Publicly, I dismissed the fisherman's myths. Privately, I still checked the wind before a cast and kept Leonie's old gravity charm, a small, dense piece of metal from a meteorite she'd found, warm in my pocket. I rolled a cigarette, a nervous tick, but didn't light it. The taste of unlit paper on my tongue was enough. Quill Sterling was there, watching from a distance, his posture one of unnerving reverence. He wasn't looking at the equipment, he was looking at the air above it. "She's quiet today," he said, his voice almost carried away by the wind. "It's a gravitational anomaly, Quill. It doesn't have a gender." doesn't it? I ignored him and initiated the launch. The tether, a shimmering line of woven alloys, shot out from the rig, disappearing into the grey soup of the sky. For the first few minutes, everything was by the book. The line unspooled, the depth readings were stable, the tension metrics were well within expected parameters. A simple, clean cast. My chest loosened. I could almost feel the transport ticket in my hand. Then, the numbers on my console changed. It wasn't a spike or a drop, it was a flip. The pull value, the measurement of the gravitational force acting on the line, went from a positive integer to a negative one. Negative 12.6, then negative 34.8. It was impossible. Gravity pulls, it doesn't push. It's a foundational rule. You can't have negative weight. It would be like having a negative rock. Getting a system error, I said into my comms. Readouts are corrupted. No, they're not, Quill said, right behind me now. I hadn't heard him approach. It's noticed us. The line went rigid. All the slack vanished in an instant. The winch, a machine built to withstand tons of force, screamed, a high-pitched metallic shriek of protest. The whole platform shook, a deep, structural tremor that didn't feel like a wave or a mechanical failure. It felt like the rig had been struck by something enormous. The deck plates beneath my boots groaned, and the single tether line pulled tight began to sing. It wasn't a sound of vibration. It was a note, a single, piercing frequency. It was the sound of a string being tuned by something on the other side. The note from the tether vibrated through the deck plates. It wasn't the shriek of stressed metal. It was something purer. A voice came over the comms. Lyle, the rig foreman. Corso, what is that? Cut the line. If I cut it under this much tension, it could snap back and shear the tower. I was staring at the winch, at the taut line that shimmered in the gloom. The rig was shaking, but the line itself was a perfect, unwavering stroke of silver against the grey sky. It's not pulling, Quill said beside me. It's tuning. It's finding our frequency. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the shuddering stopped. A profound, unnatural silence fell over the platform. I looked up and noticed something odd. The sea spray, the mist that constantly hung in the air, wasn't drifting. It was frozen. Millions of tiny droplets were suspended around us, glittering like dust in a sunbeam that wasn't there. The sky began to change. The uniform grey overhead swirled, turning a green gold, the colour of old brass. A drop of water landed on my cheek, but it was cold and it hadn't come from above. It had come from below. I looked down at the deck. Water was beading on the metal plates, pulling itself into perfect spheres, and then lifting, trembling, into the air. That's when the rain began to fall upward. It rose from the ocean in thick, cohesive ribbons of water that twisted and climbed toward the strange green sky. The storm was contained in a perfect, silent cylinder of air, centered directly on our tether line. A loose wrench on the deck rattled, then lifted a few inches, rotating slowly. I took a step and my stomach lurched, my inner ear screaming that down was no longer a reliable direction. The world felt tilted, like the whole platform was sliding off the edge of a plate. I saw Stenz, one of the roughnecks, stumble near the railing, his face slack with confusion. He reached out a hand, and for a split second, I saw two of him. A solid man and a transparent, shimmering double standing a foot to his left. He collapsed, clutching his head. And through it all, there was a breathtaking, horrifying beauty to it. The ocean pulled itself upward, catching the jaundiced light. Fish and strands of kelp, caught in the current, rose with it, suspended like sculptures in a gallery of physics. I watched a silver-scaled fish, its mouth open in a silent gasp, drift past my face before vanishing into the golden haze above. The sight was so profoundly against the rules that my mind couldn't find a place for fear. All I felt was quiet awe. The event lasted for exactly 11 minutes. I know because I was staring at my watch, watching the seconds tick by as if they were the only sane thing left. Then, with no warning, it was over. The green light vanished from the sky. The water fell back into the ocean with a sound like a world-sized exhalation. The wrench clattered back to the deck. The tether line was still there, still taut, but the piercing note had softened to a low thrum. We found Stenz huddled against a cargo container, shivering violently. His skin was pale, his lips blue, but he was completely dry. "I just came back from drowning," he whispered, his eyes fixed on something 1,000 yards away. "The water. It fills you from the inside out." Quill Sterling simply stood by the railing, looking at the tether with an expression of deep satisfaction. "It wasn't a storm," he said to me. "It was a welcome. The tide's opening." My professional instinct took over. This wasn't a dimensional event. It was a structural one. The anomaly must have caused a massive power surge, overloading a conduit in the platform substructure, creating an electromagnetic field that warped our perceptions. It was a stretch, but it was a theory I could hold on to. It was something I could fix. Grabbing a heavy-duty torch and my datapad, I headed for the access hatch to the lower pylons, a restricted area no one had entered for years. The official schematics on my pad showed a clean, simple layout of support beams and power conduits. But the rig itself told a different story. I found an access panel that wasn't on the plans, its edges sealed with a crude, hasty weld. I had to use a pry bar to get it open. I descended into the narrow shaft, the beam of my torch cutting through a darkness that felt thick and absolute. The humming from the tether was louder here, vibrating through the rig's steel skeleton. It felt less like a machine and more like the purring of a very large animal. Down in the guts of the platform, the heat was intense. The substructure here was a tight web of steel pylons, but one of them was thicker than the others, and the surface wasn't smooth. My torchlight slid across what looked like discolored, lumpy metal. I stepped closer. The heat was radiating from it, and then my light found a shape. It was a human body, a man positioned upside down, his torso and legs fused into the primary support pylon as if the steel had melted around him like wax. He was part of the rig. Thin, dark wires snaked across his exposed skin, dipping beneath the surface and re-emerging, veined into his flesh. His arms were stretched out along 2 tension lines, making him look like a crucified saint of industry. His eyes were open, filmed over but wet. I stopped breathing. The datapad slipped from my numb fingers and clattered to the floor. The system logs had no record. The crew manifest had no missing person. He was a ghost in the machine made real. I stood there frozen, the beam of my torch shaking in my hand. He was a piece of foreshadowing I couldn't understand. A warning. This is what happens. This is the price of holding on too long. My mind, searching for an anchor in the horror, snagged on a memory. Leonie, standing on the edge of the Sinkfield survey site, turning to smile at me, the red of her bandana brilliant against the grey landscape. In the beam of my torch, the anchored man's cracked, frozen lips moved. They formed a single, soundless word. Her name. A strangled noise, half gasp, half whimper tore from my throat. I stumbled backward, my boots scraping on the metal grate. My torch fell, its beam cartwheeling through the darkness, painting the scene in flashing strokes, the weeping steel, the veined skin, the silent, moving mouth. Leonie. The word echoed in the space where sound should have been, a phantom limb of a memory. I snatched the torch from the floor and scrambled back up the ladder, my movements clumsy. Every rung I climbed, I felt his open eyes on my back. I burst out onto the main deck, gasping in the salt-laced air. The world seemed steady. The wind was just wind. The sound of the waves was just water on steel. For a moment, I thought I might have imagined it, a hallucination brought on by stress and low oxygen. Then the entire platform dropped. It wasn't a shudder. It was a brutal lurch sideways that threw me against a bulkhead. Alarms didn't just sound, they shrieked, discordant and overlapping, a soundscape of pure mechanical panic. "Tether tension is critical." Lyle's voice came over the comms, shredded by static. "The automatics are shot. We're going to snap." Men were shouting, running, their movements useless in the strobing red light. The rig groaned, a guttural sound of metal tearing apart at a molecular level. This was it. This was how it ended. The platform was going to peel itself open like a can. Through the chaos, a figure moved with inhuman calm. Quill Sterling. He walked past me, his bare feet steady on the vibrating deck. He wasn't running. He was heading for a small secondary control panel near the main winch assembly. "Quill, follow procedure!" I yelled. He didn't even look at me. "The machine doesn't understand procedure anymore," he said, his voice quiet but clear, cutting through the noise. He knelt by the panel, pried open a diagnostic port with his bare fingers, and produced a bundle of coiled wires and what looked like polished bones from a pouch at his belt. He began to jam them into the port, bypassing the circuits, physically rewiring the system with his strange talismans. As he worked, he chanted, a string of syllables that felt older than the steel around us. And the screaming of the winch changed. The high-pitched shriek of imminent failure lowered in pitch, subsiding into a deep, resonant hum. The violent lurching of the rig softened into a heavy, rhythmic tremor. The alarms stuttered and died, one by one, until only the red lights remained. It had worked. He had spoken to the storm, and it had listened. Quill rose, his face slick with sweat, his calm eyes finding mine in the gloom. "It's listening now," he said, his breath pluming in the cold. "But it's hungry. It needs constant pressure. Someone has to balance it." He took a step closer. "It feels what you're carrying, Stellan. All that weight inside you. It's the only language it understands now." The rig gave another deep groan, the tremor intensifying. The brief peace he had brought us was already fading. On the far side of the deck, someone was trying to deploy an escape pod, but its launch clamp was sparking, fused shut. There was no way out. We were trapped on a dying beast, and its heart was the tether line. My scientific mind, the cartographer in me, who believed in predictable shapes and solid ground, screamed in protest. This was superstition. This was madness. But then, the image of the anchored man filled my head. His body fused to the rig, his silent lips forming Leonie's name. He wasn't a ghost. He was a schematic, a diagram of what the system required. The rig didn't need a technician. It needed ballast. I pushed past Quill. The main winch controls were right there, a console of levers and readouts that now seemed like children's toys. I put my hands on them. I closed my eyes, blocking out the red lights, blocking out Quill's quiet, watchful presence. I did the one thing I had spent 3 years refusing to do. I let myself go back. The memory was so clear it was a physical place. The grey, flat light of the sink field. The smell of wet earth and charged air. Leonie, 20 yards ahead, turning to wave, her red bandana a slash of life in the desolation. The ground didn't collapse. She didn't fall. She just wasn't there anymore. The empty space where she had stood. The crushing, silent weight of her absence. I didn't just remember the grief. I opened the door and invited it in, letting the raw, undiluted agony I had walled off pour through me. The denial, the rage, the endless pain. It filled my chest, a physical pressure that stole my breath. And the controls responded. The vibration under my hands synced to the rhythm of my breathing. I felt the pull from the tether, a tugging sensation in my solar plexus, as if the line was anchored directly to my sorrow. I adjusted a lever, not based on a readout, but on a lurch in my gut. The rig's heavy tremor subsided, matching the new, agonizing rhythm I had set. I was no longer fighting the system. I was a part of its circuit. My pain was the power that kept it from breaking. I opened my eyes, sweat dripped from my jaw, and my whole body shook with the effort. But the rig was steady. Silence deep and profound had fallen. I had done it. I looked up, my eyes drawn to the edge of the platform. Through the swirling mist, a figure was standing waist-deep in the dark, churning water. It was a man in a decades-obsolete deep-sea exosuit, heavy and riveted, crusted with deposits. A single green-yellow helmet light flickered on, piercing the gloom. He wasn't swimming. He wasn't struggling. He was just standing there, waiting, as if he'd been expecting me. I blinked, and he was gone. The mist swirled into the space where he had been, leaving only the dark, uneasy water. My hands were still on the controls, and I could feel the pull through them, a steady, immense weight that had taken root in my marrow. It was no longer a fight, it was a balancing act. My grief for Leonie, once a private thing, was now a public utility. The fuel that kept this entire platform from being torn apart. The rest of the crew kept their distance. I saw them moving in the periphery, their faces pale, their eyes skittering away from me as if I were the source of the anomaly itself. They'd brought me food, a protein bar and a canteen of water, leaving it on a crate a safe 10 feet away, like an offering to a volatile god. I was no longer Stellan Corso, surveyor. I was the keeper of the line, a man plugged into a machine of sorrow. The initial adrenaline had drained away, leaving a bone-deep exhaustion in its place. I stared out at the ocean, my eyes gritty and unfocused. The sky had returned to a familiar, overcast grey. The sea looked normal, but my training, the years spent mapping terrain and spotting subtle inconsistencies, wouldn't let me rest. A cartographer sees the world in lines, contour lines, fault lines, horizon lines. And the horizon was wrong. It wasn't a trick of the light or the curvature of the earth. It was a perfect arc, as if the entire ocean were being held in a vast, invisible bowl. The tide lock platform was at the bottom of that bowl. I watched for a long time, trying to rationalize it, to blame it on fatigue or a distortion in the rig's reinforced windows. I looked up. The clouds weren't drifting with the wind. They were flowing, their edges fraying as they were drawn toward a single invisible point in the sky directly above the tether's anchor point. It was a slow, majestic, terrifying swirl, like a galaxy being born in our atmosphere. The understanding hit me. The maps, the physics, everything I knew was inside out. We hadn't hooked something. We were the hook. The anomaly wasn't being pulled into our reality. It was pulling our reality into its own. The tidelock platform was no longer just a rig. It was the anchor point, the new center of gravity for a world coming undone. Just as the thought solidified, the rig gave a jolt so violent it threw me to my knees. "Main tether integrity at 2%, Lyle's voice announced over the comms. "It's over!" The pull I felt through the console became an unbearable, tearing force. The system wasn't just hungry anymore. It was ravenous. My grief wasn't enough. My pain wasn't enough. The line was going to snap, and when it did, the resulting pullback, the snap of cosmic elastic, would unmake everything. It would take the platform, the ocean, maybe the whole damn continent. Quill appeared beside me, as if summoned by the finality of the moment. He placed a hand on my shoulder. "You hold the line too tight, Stellan," he said, his voice as calm as a flat sea. "That's why it always cuts." I stared at him, my mind unable to process the words. "What are you talking about? It's breaking." "No," he said, shaking his head slowly. "It's asking for more weight. It needs a truer anchor." He looked from me to the shimmering tether line, and his expression was not one of fear, but of profound homecoming. "Most people try to resist the pull. That's why it breaks them. You don't pull against gravity. You lean into it." He walked away from the console, toward the center of the deck where the air itself seemed to waver and distort. He unclipped the safety tether from his belt, the metallic click deafening in the sudden quiet between the throbbing alarms. He stood there, a lone figure at the edge of a precipice I couldn't see, and turned to look at me one last time. His eyes held no judgment, no pity, only a deep, ancient understanding. Then he let go. He didn't fall. He didn't fly. The space around him folded. For a single instant, the world bent inward. The deck plates, the railing, the grey sky, all collapsing toward him as if he were a hole in reality. He was simply erased from the picture. There was no sound, no flash of light, just a neat surgical removal. The moment he vanished, the terrible, tearing strain on the line vanished with him. The low, thudding alarm stopped. The rig settled, a long, weary sigh of steel. The crushing weight in my chest eased, replaced by a manageable, familiar hum. He had been right. He had offered himself to the system, and the system had accepted his offering. He had become the ballast. I stood alone on the silent platform. The crew were gone, either hiding in their bunks or taken by the lurch. I was the only one left. The sole operator of a machine I now understood far too well. The line was stable. The world was safe. But I was tethered to it. A lone man holding a thread against an abyss that had just shown me its appetite and its logic. The silence Quill left behind was heavier than any sound. It filled the platform, soaking into the steel. The pull from the tether was still there, a constant living pressure against my senses. But it was no longer a frantic tearing. It was a patient, expectant weight, like a hand resting on my shoulder. I was the only thing holding it. The thought was so vast it had no edges. Days bled into one another. I don't know how many. I kept the line stable, a task that no longer required conscious thought. My body knew the rhythm of the pull. I would sleep in short, dreamless bursts, propped against the console, and wake when the pressure in my body changed, my hand moving to adjust a lever before my eyes were fully open. I was a component, a self-regulating valve made of flesh and memory. There were two options left on this platform. On one side was the emergency release for the main tether, a single guarded switch. To press it would be to let go of the line, to release the anomaly. I pictured it, the catastrophic snap of the tether, the tidal wave of inverted reality washing over the continent, erasing cities, mountains, coastlines, an act of unimaginable destruction. On the other side were the controls under my hands, to keep holding on, to remain here, a solitary ghost on a metal island, until my body gave out or until I became something else entirely, until I was fused into the rig's substructure, my skin veined with wires, my mouth frozen open, my thoughts no longer my own. A slow, quiet erasure. Destruction or integration. Let the world fall or fall with it. I leaned my head against the metal of the console. The hum of the tether vibrated through my skull. I thought of Leonie. For 3 years, her memory had been a wound, a source of unending, sharp-edged grief. I had chased the shape of her loss across maps, through data logs, into the heart of this anomaly, hoping to find a logic that would make it bearable. And now, in the crushing silence, I finally understood. The grief wasn't a wound anymore. It had become a foundation, a part of my structure. The system hadn't latched onto my pain. It had recognized it as a kindred force. Gravity is just the universe's longing for itself. Grief is the same. The pull from the line and the pull in my chest were the same law, written in different languages. She had walked into a sink field, a place where the world pulls inward. I had just found a larger one. I looked down at my hands on the controls. They seemed distant, unfamiliar. For a moment I could almost see it. The tracery of wires just beneath the skin, the way my knuckles seemed to be hardening, taking on the dark, oily sheen of the rig's metal. I felt the slow, structural thrum of the platform as my own heartbeat. I was no longer just the operator. I was the anchor. My search for a pattern was over. I had found it. This was the shape of my life. A final, perfect, terrible symmetry. I straightened up and walked over to the main comms panel. The ready light was a single point of green in the gloom. I keyed the open channel, a broadcast to no one, a final log entry for an archive that would never be found. My voice, when it came out, was a quiet resonance that belonged to the rig itself. "This isn't what I expected," I whispered into the silence, "but it's what I deserve." I cut the transmission and walked back to my post. I stood there, hands on the controls, and looked out at the ocean. The horizon was still wrong. The water still curved up to meet a sky that swirled with a slow, secret purpose. Out in the mist, just at the edge of sight, a single green-yellow light flickered on. It watched me, a silent, solitary peer in the gathering dark. I did not look away. I just held the line, waiting.